Hello, everybody, and welcome to Crushing Comics. I'm your host, Peter, also known throughout the internet as Krisis with a K. And I'm here with a little something different than what we have been doing recently, because this is our deep dive into Claremont's X-Men from the beginning. We finally convinced Fariha. Actually, I don't think it took much convincing. I think you seem pretty excited, Fariha.
Right. It was like, oh my God, you should read Claremont X-Men. I'm like, okay, stop twisting my arm. I'll read it. That's exactly how the conversation went.
Yeah. And so we are going to just start today with the three of us talking about Giant Size X-Men. And just to give it a little bit of extra meat on the bones, we're actually going to talk also about the backup story in Classic X-Men #1. So we are absolutely following the reading guide that is on my site, Crushing Krisis, for reading X-Men in order. And that's the way we're going to tackle it. So will we do more of us reading sequentially through Claremont X-Men? Let's just get through this first one and see if Fariha liked it at all. And then we can discuss the possibility for doing more of this epic X-Men reread. So in terms of spoilers, the thing to be aware of is that we're going to thoroughly spoil Claremont X-Men, possibly as a whole, even though we're only here to talk about Giant Size X-Men. But we will try to give you a brief warning before we dig deeply into anything that is current day X-Men. And I will say at the end of the issue, we are going to talk about how our reads of the Hoxpox era have changed our opinion of this. We're going to try not to intersperse it the whole time. Does that sound fair, Tyler?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you can restrain yourself?
I would try.
Okay. This is not going to be a forensic discussion of everything about X-Men. Explain the X-Men already exists for that. Nor is it just going to be whether we love it or not, because Battle of the Atom exists for that already. And they're two amazing podcasts, and you should absolutely go subscribe to them now. This is just going to be us talking about the issues and what we thought was interesting in our reactions to the issues. So let's just go around as we normally do, first impressions. And the most important first impression here is Fariha, who is truly the first impression. So this has got to be at least my 25th time reading this issue. Fariha, what did you think of the Giant Size X-Men #1 from 1975?
I have some thoughts about it. And, it just like, I'm not a fan of classic comic book. I mean, that's something I should say a get-go. So a lot of things kind of hard for me to kind of get through in like the over-verbose comic books and stuff like that. So there's definitely some of it over here. However, it's just like, I felt like this was an origin story of people I already know and have come a very long way. And somehow it feels like it's also a fan fiction from current Krakoa, as if like Krakoa wrote it. Which we will talk about it a little bit later.
Yes, let's not dig into the spoilers first thing, but there's definitely that perspective.
But the thing is, like, it's just, I mean, I actually went back and checked. This was a debut issue for a lot of these characters, which we have now known to love. So from historical point of view, I thought it was very important. And, I'm glad that I finally got around to read it.
Tyler, how many times would you say you have read this issue?
Rough estimate, I would say at least 8 times. But I think 8 times will be very conservative. So, but like let's stick with 8.
Do you feel like you got anything new from reading it again? Do you still find new things in it?
Well, I mean, it's something that I think we can talk about towards the end of this podcast, because it definitely recontextualized certain things. Not a lot of it, but knowing, having read Deadly Genesis, which I hated, and then having the surgical retcon done by Hickman for Hoxpox, it does read a touch different from and I do have a lot to say about the backup story in Classic X-Men #1 too.
I do too. Yeah. So for me,
Me too.
Cool. I have read this so many times. There was a Marvel Milestones version of it, which was what they do them as True Believers reprints, I guess now. But in the day, a Marvel Milestones reprint was with the silver trade dress that the Marvel Milestones books have, but it was a single issue. And it was on like really glossy premium paper, and it was, remastered. and it was beautiful. And I had it. I think I got it like a Comic-Con, so it was cool because at the time it was not as accessible to be able to get old issues. There's no Marvel Unlimited, and so I read it many times then. But I've read it with my daughter, and she has it like committed to memory. She reads it constantly because she has the Epic collection. And then I actually just read it panel by panel painstakingly closely last month because there was a tribute issue to it to celebrate its anniversary. And the thing I want to kind of first kind of picture or draw in the mind, and I want to hear Fariha's response to this a little bit, is picture reading this as somebody for relatively little affinity for this property. Like, you're talking about coming to it now kind of loving most of these characters already, but the X-Men had been on the ice for almost a decade with a few scant guest appearances, more like half a decade, but still. And they weren't the most beloved Marvel characters. So the whole concept of the issue that maybe they were all dead was a fine thing to do, because they were not going to have any being like, no, I'm not going to read it because they're dead. Like, they were not that popular at the time. Can you imagine what it would be like to kind of go into this as a totally fresh reboot of something? Because at the time it really was a totally fresh reboot, even though now we look at it as this monolithic classic and the start of the modern era.
I'm simply surprised by the fact that all these characters were first appearances. Like, I did not know this until I looked it up, that these were, like, I always thought that Nightcrawler, Storm were there from X-Men from get-go.
Oh, really?
But
That's
it wasn't.
so interesting.
Even Wolverine, I didn't know that. I always thought they were there from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, let's dissect that for a second.
So and then also Wolverine... No, I was just going to say Wolverine, even before that, was just in Hulk. That's it. Like Hulk 181. He wasn't, I don't think he was even a mutant over there, or it was just like all of this just happened here. And, it was also very much like, getting people together, like, very X-Men First Class movie like, minus Magneto.
Yeah, and this is the first appearance full scale for Nightcrawler, Colossus, Storm, and Thunderbird. Wolverine, Banshee, and Sunfire had debuted previously, but really just in a scant number of issues. Sunfire debuted in X-Men 64. Banshee debuted back in, 30 or 31. Wolverine had just been in Hulk. But these were characters that had very little precedent for them in other comic books. So even the ones that kind of existed were relative blank slates. And you have to think that even Polaris and Havoc, who are seen as part of the team here, really only got added to the X-Men team around issue 50 of the original X-Men run. So even for them, they didn't like this. There were not a lot of characters with a deep history in this comic book, other than the core four of the X-Men, because of Beast, is already blue at this point and not present in this adventure. And it's amazing. One of the things I think about is looking at this Nightcrawler sequence, which is iconic. It's so visually iconic. The way that Cockrum draws the pain on his face as he sees himself being reviled and kind of reflects that hatred back on the mob. And Nightcrawler gets 3 whole pages, which no one else gets. Some people get 2.5, but broken up between other people's introductions. Nightcrawler gets 3 pages all on his own. And I think it's really significant. And I want to hear Tyler's thoughts on this, that this starts hard with the hated and feared theme, which you did not get in every issue of Silver Age X-Men, even though it existed and it was a thing. I mean, we kick off this era straight off with this guy who does not look human, he cannot pass for human, and he is definitely hated and feared, and that frames this entire issue.
I remember when I first read this for the very first time, and I believe it was a reprint in a floppy form. And I think it has a silver or gold
It's the
border.
same one, yeah.
Yeah, so that was the only time that, the first time I could get my hand on it. And I was pretty excited. And when I first read it, I was like, I did not like it as much as I thought I would. And part of the reason, I think, is because the characters are a little bit off from what I understood them to be, having read quite a lot of Claremont's later works. So the characters will evolve. And distinctively, Nightcrawler is really bitter. I mean, the way his thoughts are is pretty bitter here, which you will find it changes almost immediately with the next issue. And I think one of the reasons why he has 3 pages of introduction here is because Cockrum is a huge fan of Nightcrawler.
Right. Cockrum had all of these as original sketches that some of them he had shopped to DC for different books at a point, and some of them are combinations of characters that he was going to try elsewhere. Storm, very famously, is a combination of a couple of different character concepts. So Cockrum had a great affinity for the character designs, which is part of, you can just feel the love. But I also think it's interesting that you said that about the voices. And I want to hear Fariha talk about this a little bit, because I always get the impression that Wine kind of wanted to write everybody as kind of the asshole in this issue. Like there's really nobody that's super likable. It's like Nightcrawler's feeling hatred, and Wolverine's mean, and Cyclops is mean to Wolverine, and Thunderbird is mean, and it's kind of like Banshee is maybe the one that's allowed to be nice. And it kind of feels to me moving forward that Claremont figured out pretty quickly that you couldn't have everybody be that mean. And because there's like no levels. But did you get that, Fariha? Did you feel like they were all kind of mean to each other in this issue?
That's kind of like, the idea of like forming a team, right? Because they were all scared individually, and now they get to come together, and even then they don't know each other and they're not sure who to trust. I thought it was very natural and normal for them to be like this, I was kind of like a little bit taken aback by that, like, his Nightcrawler is kind of tend to be a little bit German, like, and his, like, I mean, he is German, not tend to be, he is German, but his voice kind of, or there's like an accent associated with his words, and, there isn't. He talks like an American person in this most of the time. But the one that was mostly shocking to me, that Professor X was just standing around allowing Nightcrawler to be staked until he decided to step in and stop. Like he was just there all that time, just watching. That kind of stood out to me more. And then, this was like, talk about old-timey kids comic that they actually showed that someone is about to be staked.
Like he's just about to get a stake right through the heart, and it's
right through the heart, and it was because he just couldn't take it. Like this was a suicide attempt. I think that it was very dark for like within like the first 3 pages of a character's first appearance, who will go on to be awesome later on.
Well, and I do think though, to both of your points, that a lot of these depictions get referenced when they need to like recenter these characters, even though it's just one issue of them kind of briefly. And that kind of self-loathing aspect of Nightcrawler does tend to come back, even when he gets happy-go-lucky, even when he gets very Catholic. They do tend to come back to that. And, I think Colossus's kind of, I'm just a simple boy who cares about my family, Storm's, I'm a goddess, like these original depictions are really used as touchstones. And Claremont never like full-on contradicts them. He adds nuance to them, and he starts doing it right away in classic number 1. The one for me that always sticks out and makes me stop is the first panel of Storm flying through the air. I mean, this was a decade where we had just come off of a couple of years where Marvel was really trying to introduce some Black superheroes, and there were, nobody in X-Men, and we go from, Nightcrawler, Banshee, they're international, but they're all white. I mean, Nightcrawler's blue, but he's ostensibly white. And we get Storm, and I guess my question for you, and I know this can get into a really thorny topic really fast, but she's nude here. But do you feel that the nude is a sexualizing nude, or do you think that it's kind of just meant to communicate her oneness with nature? Because I can never decide for myself, and I'm really interested to hear from you as somebody who's seeing these panels for the first time.
I actually kind of took it as like, this is just how she is.
That's how I feel too.
This is like, it didn't feel like forced or anything, or it felt like my one question was, she's just pretending to be a god, right? I mean, she's not real. Like, she's not really a god. Well, or is she? Like, so the thing is, I wasn't sure whether this was an act and she needed to, like, kind of appear a little bit more shocking than usual. And then, with her hair and then, the nudeness and everything. But it didn't feel like an artist forced his perspective on the character versus the character is like that. You know what I mean? I mean, that's something I always say about Emma Frost. When she is walking around without much clothes, it feels like that's how she is. But if Jean Grey suddenly starts doing that, then it's like, okay, come on. That's not the character you would think to do that. But in this scenario, it just felt like she's just trying to pull up an act or trying to do something like, just more like separate her from the people that she's helping.
Well, Tyler, what's your perspective on that? Because, of course, we've read a lot of Uncanny X-Men, so we know Claremont will revisit this theme of is Storm really a goddess?
Yeah.
But how do you react to some of those things that Fariha just brought up?
I mean, for me, is I remember. I distinctively remember that I wasn't really bothered by it, and I thought that I guess when I first read this, I was in Singapore, right? So I have never met any African person in real. There is a distinct lack of Black people in Singapore. So all I know of African and American Africans are from TVs and things like that. So I thought that she is a goddess in an African tribe, and it's quite natural for her to be bearing and not wearing anything. And I kind of like that later on Claremont actually built on this, on how she wasn't shy about like just taking off her clothes, and because it's natural to her. And but I do not think that she's playing a role here. I think at this point in her life, because of people worshiping her and because of her powers, she might actually think that she's someone who is more powerful than a normal human being, and she's kind of like a goddess.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and I've always read it that she's in sort of a symbiotic relationship with the people there. She knows she's different, and she knows she can exude some kind of control over the world and of the weather. And she's pretty sure she's not a god, but it's kind of like if she can help them, and if it helps them to think of her as a goddess, then she will be their goddess. And I feel like that's been reinterpreted many times over. And it's really interesting. I can't help but read this differently, having very recently reread Life, Death 2 and the 196 of Uncanny X-Men, because Claremont really goes back and layers in a lot of things for Storm there that helps recontextualize this. So it's interesting. I think she's cognizant of the fact that she's not really a goddess. And I think, but the thing she would say to you, Fariha, is kind of like, but does it hurt anyone for me to play the role of a goddess if they want me to be one?
And that's what I thought. And that's what I was saying, though.
Yeah.
She knows that she's not, though, right? It was just important to me for me to know that. I mean, she knows that she's not a goddess. She's just doing something because that's kind of works. And it was a complete contrast with how Nightcrawler was dealing with his mutancy versus how she was.
Yeah, and you have to think that these people don't necessarily know that they're mutants, right? Like mutants was not as widespread of a thing. Even like 100 years or 100 issues after this, there's an Avengers comic I recently read where somebody's like, I think they might be one of those mutants. I don't know. We don't know a lot about them. I'm like, Beast is on your team. And like Scarlet Witch, like you've met mutants before. But like this was at a point that the whole idea of the proliferation of mutants was unusual. There weren't really like mutant characters that had not at least started out as X-Men characters. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were in Avengers, but they were X-Men characters before Avengers adopted them. Yeah. So it wasn't like now where like every book is like, oh no, it turns out we're fighting a mutant. Like that just didn't exist. And so Professor X was kind of showing up to these people, and in some of these instances, basically telling them, oh, by the way, this thing that you can do makes you a mutant. Were you aware of that?
Right. And then
definitely.
I think like, how she was dealing with it is just because, it just worked for her. And good for her.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about possibly the littlest known character out of this lineup, which is John Proudstar, who no spoilers for Fariha, but we'll get there. There's reasons that he's not the most well-known of these characters. And he has a really fraught scene with Professor X where he's like, I don't need your help. And when has a white man ever actually done something that's really helpful for any Indigenous American person? Like it's all plague blankets is kind of the subtext of this scene. How did that hit you, and how did you feel about Proudstar as a member of this team?
well, there's the reason he's no longer there. I'm sorry, but the thing is, I think like there's two prongs to that, because he is right about his, his hatred or like his dislike for Caucasian people, and that's like very legit. And one of the things that kind of identifies, like, because they don't know that they are mutants, there's no solidarity from that point of view. It's just like what as a human. But at the same time, this is the only, we don't, even to this day, we don't have many indigenous representation. And one you introduce, he's just straight up the angry version of it. Is that a good thing? What does it do for representation? Like, so far we have Storm, who you've shown, very much in her element, and then you're showing this another second person of color who is also like, very much white man. I don't know. I was kind of like, wasn't sure what to think about it from that point of view.
I think before Tyler chimes in,
and also because I'm just gonna say, historically, I know this character didn't survive.
Well, before I turn it back over to Tyler to respond as well, I think you raise a really good point that, you could look at all of these characters, right, with a very kind of bland approach to diversity and go, well, they're all shown in their environment, right? Like they're all, classes on a farm in Russia. How's that different? But then you have to also interpret how the characters of color are perhaps treated differently. Like Storm's, tribe is just shown as these, random people in a desert. Claremont later goes back and corrects that a little bit and shows that like Africa is not necessarily just people wandering in deserts, that there's towns and there's technology and there's civilization, which is the reality. And I think, you get that sense with Storm, you kind of get that sense with Proudstar, and even, Sunfire, who gets the briefest introduction here of everybody, is like, oh, let's have a Japanese tea ceremony because he's Japanese.
Exactly.
And it's like, we're definitely leaning into the stereotype on the characters of color a little bit more than we are for the white characters, I think. So Tyler, where would you like to pick that conversation up?
The context for introducing an international cast is pretty interesting, because Marvel at that time, I think, had an idea that, well, if you get more international people to appear in our comics, then, it would entice them to buy the book. But then you started to choose people like from Africa, which probably does not have any Marvel comics at that time. And a German, okay, maybe you do get some Marvel comics in Germany, but the choices of the characters was actually not ideal for making this more international comics. And I feel like maybe the original idea is that, well, if I have a Japanese character appear in the comics, I should place that character in a context that will be understood by Japanese readers, just so that it brings it a little bit closer to them before we bring them to America and do the American superhero stuff. So that, I thought that might be the reason for it.
And I think that's actually a really interesting point that I've never thought of before, that even within the cultural context, that the introduction of Sunfire in a very recognizable cultural setting is different than the more kind of caricaturized things that we see Storm or Proudstar doing, like Proudstar's like mid wrestling a buffalo, like.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So the team gets assembled. Go ahead, Fariha.
No, I was just going to say that in Colossus, like I'm pretty sure the Russian people will understand farming, because that's where we see Colossal. But the Colossal or Colossus?
Colossus.
But Colossus, okay. But his parents, are they still around? Because he was in a very loving family situation and very understanding. Something that took me aback a little bit.
I don't know if they're still alive. Are they, Tyler?
I think, I can't remember now.
I think something has happened to them.
Something happened to them. Yeah.
Oh no.
A little Ileana. So cute. With
and Magic's first appearance.
Did you get that that's magic? Like, did that click for you?
I know. Yeah, I did. It did. I know that. I know her. Like, and I'm
now you do. Yeah.
I mean, I was like, oh no, that little magic, So that was very it kind of felt good to kind of make those connections, but at the same time, like, oh, we never hear about them. They're so nice, like those parents. You don't get nice parents in Mutant World, guys. That's why. Whenever I see some, I'm always like very appreciative of them.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the art some more before we get into the back half, the Krakoa part of this issue. There's this point where the team gets assembled, they go with Cyclops to the island, and they split up into pairs to find their way to the center of the island after the X-Jet gets swallowed up by the island. And there's this page that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, there's 9, 10 panels, and not just like a 9-panel grid, but these vertical slices that are so small. And Cockrum depicts so many things that I look at this one page and I think this is like an issue. We get from Cyclops pointing at the camera to the top, we get the structure in the distance, they make a plan, we see them go into the forest, they fight off these giant tree vines, they tear them apart, and they finally get to the structure. I'm like, that was like an arc of a current comic, and we got it in one page, and some of the panels are so slim that I don't even think a modern letter balloon would even fit into them.
I thought that was genius. The fact that, all these 3 teams, you are correct that this would have been all each individual issue, but thank God it's not. And it's done so well in one page, one page each. And then you get the team dynamic. You understand what the characters, how they react to each other, how they react to a situation that they're not necessarily interested in being. And it was very well done.
It shows how methodical, not just, and this is, Cockrum and Wein are 2 of the best creators of all time. Let's just put that out there. But it also goes to show that comics had to be economical at this point. A kid was just going to pick this up off a newsstand and get it or not. And so there's this methodical nature to how it's set up. They all get an introduction scene. They all get the band together scene. Cyclops tells them what the mission is and just, describes it with flashback. And then they get paired off. And in every pairing, we get to see each of them use their powers. There's this very specific formula here. And even though it can be a little dull if you're reading it month after month, which we will get into if we keep reading Claremont, it's also just surprisingly effective. The sheer volume of information that gets communicated.
Definitely. I know that a lot of readers who are used to modern comics is the main complaint would be let the art shows. Don't tell me what the art is showing. But you have to remember that these older comics, that at that time, there's no way for you to buy an issue if you have missed it. There's no concept of local comics shop at that time.
Right, the direct market was just starting to happen at this point in history. Yeah.
So that's so every issue that someone picks up has to be written in a way that it is their first issue. So you need to describe the character's power, you need to introduce them and, sort of hint a little bit at the dynamics, and sometimes, outright just, repeat the same thing over and over again. But if you don't doing that, even as a, okay, let me ask this question. How many times have a new characters appear and then you see him or her power is that shooting something out of the hands, and you're like, what is the power? Is it shooting laser? Is it shooting magic, gel? Or is it shooting, pheromones or something like that? You don't know, because the art is supposed to tell you what it is. And then, having captions here telling you that storm controls the weather, or showing Thunderbird as extremely strong and athletic, and that kind of sort of inform you and describe the characters to you as well. So I thought it is necessary. So being very efficient with storytelling and recapping things, and then showing reaction to certain things in terms of facial expression and body language. I think this is definitely done very, very well here.
Yeah, the thing that to me always that is remarkable about this particular issue is that's, captions in older comics can be a lot. And we will get to a point if we keep reading Claremont that there are some issues where I will straight up skip the captions because I even as I read them to the kid, will find that I've described something about the art and then I get to the caption and it says the actual words that I used to describe the art. So the point that the caption and me both were able to describe the art that way, did we need the caption? Maybe not. But I think this one, because of how much small paneling Cockrum uses, that he does some things. I'm in the part of chapter 4 where they introduce Krakoa. Images flood mutant minds and they stand rooted to the spot. The sunburst brilliance of an early atomic test. Like, you need to communicate with all these small panels. What is it? That it's Krakoa kind of sharing its mental images. And that's part of what makes Cockrum's art here so effective, is that Wine is like really supporting him in the script so that he can get away with doing these little slices and these little bursts by fully contextualizing it. But I also want to talk about that point in the issue because this turns very quickly into like a creature feature, which both ties into like 50s and 60s kind of pulp comics in a way that wasn't done a whole lot in the original Silver Age run of X-Men. I mean, there's some creature-y stuff, but this feels much different than that. And also, Marvel was in a little bit of a creature feature resurgence in the 70s. This was in the middle of them having Conan fight giant monsters like this, having Tomb of Dracula and Frankenstein and stuff, as Marvel comic books. So it's interesting that this story that starts out as a very, these are hated and feared mutants, turns into, and we're fighting this giant plant monster, like it really does kind of feel like two different worlds in one comic. And it's always funny to me that Krakoa has become so central to X-Men over the years, because at the time it was just a way of writing a silly pulp comics. I mean, they shoot it into space at the end. It's a silly story.
It is, but at the same time I was thinking, I'm like, the island was just there by itself. You guys decided to come over here.
Yeah, and you're the one who detected this mutant and had to have it be on your team.
Yeah. And then you all just didn't do any research, nothing, just showed up. Well, now we know why. But, you just showed up and then you were like, oh my God, it's Man-Thing or whoever. Like, it looks like Man-Thing, right? You guys
it does. Who existed at that time. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I was like, oh, like, so the whole time and like, it just, I don't care for this kind of stories most of the time because it's like, the creature of the island was just hanging out. And you just decided to show up. There's oh my God, you guys, this creature has now captured us. I don't know what to do. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, it was a little bit surprising. But at the same time, I'm like, well.
But they're sucking, he's sucking the life energy from the mutants. So, and then he sent Cyclops back to bring him more. And unbeknownst to Cyclops, he actually killed a lot of them.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though. But the thing is, it would have made sense if it's like, they were feeling drawn to them, and that's why they went there. But no, Cerebro found us, and they're like, yeah, we're going to go there. So it's just like, you're at fault.
Well, here's where we have to put out the warning. Here's where we have to put out the warning. Now I think we're going to start talking about some more recent spoilers from 2005 too. We're going to try to not talk about the past couple of weeks because we know how new that is for people.
Yeah.
But this has been recontextualized several times, right? Deadly Genesis introduces the idea that there was another team that went between the X-Men team and this team to the island. And then also, now that we're in the Hickman era of X-Men, you have the idea that Mura would have already known that Krakoa existed and would have already told Xavier because she had that initial kind of brain meld with him almost over a decade prior to this point. So he already knew that Krakoa was going to be part of their plans. So it's kind of like, did he necessarily know what was going to happen exactly by sending them to Krakoa and the people getting stuck there and whatever? Like, probably not, because then would Mora have sacrificed her in-between team? No, like some of it had to have been surprising in some way. But you have to think, in each of Mora's lives, things are going slightly different than they were in a previous life because of her choices. But it kind of recontextualizes this a lot because you can't help but be thinking about these things as you read it as a modern reader. Like, Xavier knew exactly what he was getting into here. Krakoa is one of the pieces he needs on the board.
So the only way for me to kind of make it make sense in my head that this is a story Exodus is telling those kids around the campfire, and it never happened. And then, or Krakoa is telling this through that other which is what's the name of the other New Mutant who's the Krakoa talks through and he doesn't really like it? Like,
Mondo.
Oh, Mondo, where it shows up in his stomach. Like
so it's like Krakoa is telling this story through Mondo just to kind of just mess up with everyone. And then, he's telling all those New Mutants that this is the story it happened. It never happened this way. This was just an old... it's like a fan fiction that Krakoa is writing, or Exodus telling the kids.
But then, the other thing also might be that because the plan to send Krakoa to space was devised by Xavier, so there might be a reason why he's doing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I reread it now, that there was like a need to take Krakoa off of the table for a period. But who knows? I mean, who knows how many more flashbacks we're going to get to explain this?
Yeah, I mean, so that Krakoa is not nuked, right? With all the rest of the islands that mutants ever been. Like, that's what humans tend to do. Yeah. So maybe that was also a reason.
Something in that whole Krakoa sequence that always jumps out at me too is that we defined all of these characters with all these powers, but they didn't necessarily have a plan for like what all of them would do. There's this one where like everybody's jumping onto Krakoa and Nightcrawler is just like, like in the background, like what, and he's a great character who we all love, but it's like, did you really think this through? What is Nightcrawler going to do in this situation? But I actually always love this because of the sequence of Storm and Polaris receiving the information from Xavier. There's that great pink psychic bolt as Xavier learns things about Krakoa, and then there's this page that almost has like a stained glass quality because Storm is in the middle with her arms raised in the central panel, and then there's adjoining panels, and then Storm and Polaris make a connection, and like this is pretty cool stuff to have Storm and Polaris kind of being central to this whole thing as two of the most powerful characters here. This is pretty cool stuff for 1975. And so even though when you reread it, the action is actually so brief. It's like they're all punching Krakoa for a page and then they shoot it into space. I actually find it satisfying. 'Cause then there's the tidal wave and then Iceman makes them afloat. And then like they really thought of some cool stuff to do with this cast of, as they say, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men?
Yeah.
And then they also did it very, very cleverly by saying that, we can show you the action. I'm like, hey! But that this would be in current days, there would be one issue would be dedicated just for that. Like, but then it was like, it was so epic, we can't even tell you. I'm like, Krakoa is writing this. It's a story written by Krakoa and transmitted by Mondo to the little kids. That's how it's happening. That's the only way to explain this.
Well, let's shift focus a little bit to classic X-Men #1. So for people who don't know, the direct market is in full swing by 1986. Comic shops have appeared all across the land. But now these 70s issues are actually getting quite hard to find and starting to go up on the aftermarket. I remember you could still get a copy of Giant Size X-Men probably like in the hundreds when I first started reading, maybe the low thousands in 1991, because it was just before the cartoon had come out. But they weren't super accessible is the point. So classic X-Men started as a reprint series to reprint from the beginning of the Claremont run, which really effectively starts with Giant Size X-Men. They had a similar reprint, Marvel Tales, I think, for Spider-Man that was reprinting old ASM issues as well. And so to make it worth buying a little bit more, and because Claremont is an obsessive control freak, and that's why we love him, Claremont decides that he's going to write a backup story in every one of these issues, some of which will expand the issue itself, some of which will be totally separate from the issue. And actually in the background, in Tyler's shot, if you happen to be watching this, he's got the whole omnibus of this, the classic X-Men omnibus, and somewhere to the side of me here, they actually released these in a pair of trade paperbacks too. So and this has only been in the last couple of years that these have happened. So if you've always wanted to read all these various backup stories, now you can. And they also inserted some additional panels into the original issues, which I think is pretty cool. But
and they also changed some of the dialogues.
They do change some of the dialogue. So all of this preamble is to say that this is Claremont's shot to recontextualize some aspects of what would happen with these 13 X-Men being in the mansion after this, because we don't get a whole lot of that when we get back in Uncanny X-Men 94. And also you have to think about what was happening at the time in 1986. This was kind of like around the time of Inferno, more or less, in the X-Men comics. And so some of the things we get with like Cyclops not making time for Jean and Jean saying, well, he loves me anyway, definitely are meant to kind of rhyme with what's going on in the modern comics that Claremont's writing at the same time. So it's like multi-stack layer cake of what's happening, of Claremont trying to insert some things he wished he had inserted at the time, like Jean being attracted to Wolverine, something that was not there originally. Claremont trying to deepen the understanding of some of the characters, and then also Claremont trying to like do some cinematic parallels with what was happening in the current X-Men comics, which to me is what makes these backup stories so wild, because there's so many things are happening. So that was a lot of me talking. Tyler, had you ever read these classic X-Men stories before? You have.
I have the entire run, and I started collecting it because, like I said, my uncle's collection started with the Fall of the Mutants.
So you had to.
So I need to read all the back issues, and the only affordable way then was to buy Classic X-Men. And at that time, I actually did not know that Claremont changed some of the original dialogue or added. Well, when he added panels, you could tell because it's drawn by someone else. Yeah. It's like distinctively different. But you know, the changes in the dialogue, I only knew recently when I read through the omnibus.
So Fariha, now we come to you, who's kind of reading these both at the same time in the way that Claremont probably would have wanted, right? Like you're his ideal because you're getting his retcon along with the original. What did you think of this classic X-Men story?
I think it was very interesting once the recap happened. You know, it was very like, you know, just to see how the different ideas of being mutant means. And I think it's something that is very relevant in this day and age of being, you know, being a minority and what it means and how you contribute. And so it was very interesting to kind of see that that aspect of it. So I read it in Marvel Unlimited. I have no idea whether these are changed dialogue, the correct dialogue, the original, or
well, Marvel Unlimited just has the backup story. But if you have it in one of these physical collections, if there was a page where they made some tweaks to the original issue, they actually will like excerpt that. So if you happen to be somebody who's reading this on Marvel Unlimited, very easy to do, very affordable. You're just
super
getting the backup story. Yeah,
but not the additional panels and not the changed dialogue. Because that happens within the issue itself, like the original issue itself.
Oh, okay. Well, that's perfect. That's fine. But yeah, so I think like that I liked this better, like, you know, from like compared to like a giant size X-Men, because it was just like, okay, the team come together and they went on a mission, and then they sent an island that just was hanging out off to space for no reason. Well, maybe there's a reason, but this one was mostly, it felt like, okay, this is how the team coming together, and then what it meant to be mutant for each one of them. And we actually get to learn the characters more compared to what we did in giant size X-Men.
Well, and I think that some of them come out thematically in a way that won't happen for a while. And Claremont like takes the time here. Like there's this wonderful moment between Colossus and Nightcrawler where Colossus is like, I've always thought about being different and that this makes me different, but Nightcrawler doesn't really have a choice to be different. And they have such a long-standing brotherhood between the two of them. And I actually really prefer having read this early. Like, I don't think Claremont does as good of a job at establishing this for years to come. And it's actually more effectively done here than I think he does it in any of the original run.
No, definitely.
I also don't know who this Bobby Drake is. I don't know who that is.
This is that's what he was like. This was what Iceman was like.
This is not good. There's not a lot of things that's wrong with Bobby, and I don't like this Bobby at all. I want my Topman, like, gay club going Bobby back.
Yeah, well, Bobby's deeply in the closet here, although that was not necessarily conceptualized quite yet, but...
Yeah, I know that makes sense. But the thing is, I think there's a lot of ideas that are being introduced here that is actually, I thought was fascinating. Like that whole scene between all four of them were fairly fascinating. And also later, Storm and Angel as well.
Yeah.
What did you think about the Wolverine and Jean love connection here, Fariha?
Yeah. Not good. I mean, you guys keep on saying flirting or that Jean is into it, so I don't know what version you all read. That was nothing about that was consensual. Like, there was nothing that was good about that, and that was just horrifying and horrible, and I am just so pissed off about it. Like, it's not good at all. like, I mean, I don't know.
Well, I do not need to recast that as being consensual. She just says at the end that she's like fascinated with him. That's
why?
I don't know why. I don't know why. But
that's what I was like, no, please.
But I find it today, even as I like read all the way to Dark Phoenix, and you get this really emotional moment with Wolverine and Jean, it just feels like it's something. It feels like it was something that was in Claremont's head that like never quite made sense on the page, and now and everybody considers it this permanent part of canon. But in those 40 initial issues from here to Uncanny X-Men 137, I just don't feel like it's there hardly at all. And I feel like this is like Claremont kind of trying to like massage it into the...
No. Wasn't that an issue where Wolverine bought roses into the hospital?
Yes.
For Jean?
Yes.
That is in canon, right? No, that was in canon. No.
We'll see.
This one came in... Well, this one is written like after that, right? So I think Claremont is just trying to recontextualize it so that this happens much earlier instead of that random scene that appear out of nowhere, that kind of thing.
No disrespect. No, I'm just saying no disrespect to Mr. Claremont. He's a great writer, and I'm pretty sure as I continue on, I would understand it. I did not understand what was happening over here. Like, I did not get it.
I think that's a fair criticism because it came out of nowhere. Wolverine was advancing pretty aggressively towards her. Like it's. I think I don't know. It's meant to be flirting, but it doesn't read very much as flirting.
No, it doesn't. It reads in a really aggressive, creepy.
Yeah,
and we know historically that Wolverine stings a lot. So. Someone with that much body odor.
That's not historically. That is Hickman and Bendis, I think, writing Wolverine.
No, he has smelled for Bendis. That is not a Bendis creation.
No.
No, he's been stinking all across Aaron's run. He's been stinking in Mark Miller's run. He's like, historically, it's just a lot of years and years of grime that just with him. But yeah, it's just like I don't know. It's just very different. Like I think I hate the idea that she's already in love with someone and that person is not giving her a lot of time, so she's in a vulnerable place, and this man is like, hey, what's up? And it's like, no, stop that. Give Jean more agency. Give Jean more agency.
Well,
that's what I'm talking about.
I mean, you have to think that Claremont did get to write the classic Jean up until 137. But Claremont, ultimately, in the scope of his run, has not written a ton of Jean issues because he doesn't really get her back after that. And he didn't want her to necessarily be brought back to life. Claremont barely ever has written Iceman and Archangel ever. So this kind of like Iceman is the dejected kid brother. Angel is this kind of like overconfident flyboy. Claremont doesn't have a lot of touches on either of those two characters compared to everybody else in this cast. Polaris, Havoc, Cyclops, all of the new folks. He spends much more time getting to write all of them than he gets to write Jean, Iceman, or Angel.
Yeah, and then so later on when Jean says to Professor X, like, he's like, different. I'm like, girl, why? That was my reaction. I'm like, what? No. Is it because you cannot look into Cyclops' eyes? Is that what it is? Girlfriend, let's talk about this. Like,
no, but there are two things here which I want to point out. Like, the first thing is Wolverine showing his claws coming out from his hand.
Right, which hadn't happened in the comics for a while.
Yeah, and that shouldn't happen here because I think in issue either 99 or 100, they were surprised to see him have claws coming out from him. So
they thought it was just the glove. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this shouldn't happen here. And then the other thing is how creepy is Professor X?
So
he's listening in to all the conversations going on in the house while he's in the study, like, apparently doing certain things.
We always knew that he's a Proudstar. And then he also know to whoa, I shouldn't be listening to that conversation.
As if that makes it much better.
That one conversation was over the limit. Okay, thanks, Charlie.
Whoa. I never liked Professor X. Like, he was never, because he has way too much power and I don't think he uses this properly. And this just kind of solidifies a lot of that. It's like, ugh. But we talking about how Docs is laid out, who knows why he was doing a lot of these things.
Yeah, this is one of those issues that I have to believe that later writers like Brubaker on Deadly Genesis and Hickman are aware of, even though it's like a side issue, because just so much of what he's saying here actually fits so perfectly with the retcons that have since been introduced. You know, Xavier says he's had his eye on these recruits for a while. Like, yeah, and we know that Deadly Genesis happened before this, and we also know that Mura is in the background with a more active role. Like, of course he knew. Like, some of these are Omega mutants that he was always going to have to get in touch with, like Storm, you know? And the same thing where he's talking about Wolverine's potential. I mean, this comes after, you know, Mura's Life 9 with Apocalypse, where Wolverine is like still around, you know, at that point. Like, Wolverine was critical to the plan. There was never going to be not Wolverine.
Life 6 too.
Yeah.
Life 6, Moira and Wolverine was in that dome thing for like for the longest of time. Yeah.
Right.
And it just tracks really well, actually. So we're going to get to some issues where you have to really bend your brain to try to understand how it works in the modern context of Deadly Genesis and Hickman's X-Men. This one, I think, reads perfectly if you've been reading new stuff. You can see all of the machinations in play.
Yeah.
No, I'm just going to say that, like, how I talked about, like, for Giant Size X-Men, it felt like a fan fiction. This does not feel like that. This actually feels like this happened. You know, this can still happen in terms of, like, you know, in terms of, like, what we are reading right now. So, and then, so when he said that, Wolverine has a lot of potential and stuff, I'm like, still go to the man and tell him that you suck about, like, how you're approaching women. I don't know. Like, you know, one should not be forgiving the other. Like, you know, so it's like, ugh.
What about John Bolton's art?
I was just going to say that. Fariha, what did you think about his art?
His art is very much classic look, like what I'm used to, like, seeing in, like, that era. So it didn't quite like, you know, stand out to me as David Cockrum's work did, because of all the panelings and stuff. This felt very standard, and what you see a little bit like a flattish art, which not a bad thing. It's just how the thing was. But the thing is, I don't know, is it because I was reading it like digitally, but the red in Jean's hair was too much. That is not natural at all. And it was like, I think to me, that where my eyes were going every time.
Well, and that's, you know, a lot of people talk about recoloring when recoloring is a bad thing, like when they go back and actually totally recolor something. But a lot of what happens in the restoration process on issues like this is that they just try to match the original color values that were on the color guides, but colorists set those original color values knowing that how much the color would be sucked up by newsprint. So what you get is like that red in Jean's hair, which just looks like the reddest red in the digital version. But and I know I have this issue somewhere physically, if you would go back to the physical version of the issue, it actually kind of looks much more plain. And this is kind of like almost like the hidden cost of restoring old comic books, is it takes a lot of nuance to get the tones right. And probably all of the colors in this issue should have had their saturation knocked back 10 or 20%. But Marvel doesn't really do that, neither does DC, and so we get these like hyper saturated colors on digital versions.
Definitely.
Yeah, and it's not, and I completely, as I was reading it, because I'm pretty sure in one of the previous episodes you told us this, Peter, and that's why
sounds like a very Peter thing to say.
Yeah, so it was in the back of my mind, and I kind of knew that this was not necessarily, this was just a product of its time and how it's being presented to nowadays. I'm pretty sure no one thought that Fariha would be reading it in Philadelphia in an iPad back when this was written in the 19.
What is an iPad?
Yeah, what is an iPad? So yeah, it kind of makes sense. Yeah.
No, but
Go ahead,
I kind of like enjoy his art a lot, actually, to be honest. Like I think it's really good. And you know, I remember like the way the shadows falls on Jean's face and Professor X head. I thought that was done really, really brilliantly.
Well, and I think Bolton, I love Bolton as an artist. He does this series, or maybe it was just a graphic novel with Claremont in black and white in the 80s called Black Dragon, which is
Hmm.
available in hardcover, which I have, and maybe it's something for me to kind of read, and because I
Yeah.
don't know that I've ever read the whole thing. But Bolton to me, I mean, he's a comic artist, he's drawing a comic, but he strikes me as almost more of like a life artist or like a fashion artist. He is really captures people's faces as being very different from each other. Jean's features are so distinct here in a way
Hmm.
that they really aren't from many people who draw
Yeah.
Jean. And also the fashion. At one point when Jean's standing next to the tree before Wolverine pops up and she's got this beautiful kind of like violet or mauve blouse and this really cool belt and then this magenta skirt. And it's like, it's just drawn with such intent that I don't think a lot of the people at that time that we see on X-Men were necessarily great at drawing the real life fashions. And so they tend to be very kind of like silly and almost funny, like people just dress how you would expect a character from the 70s to be dressed. But
Hmm.
these characters actually just feel really distinct in their dress and their faces. You know, Angel's face is really distinct. Jean's face is distinct. Jean and Xavier just do such fascinating facial acting in that last scene. And like, I don't know if Bolton would be a good pick for a big action comic, but for
No.
like a comic like this that's really about people's emotions, I
Yeah.
think Bolton is actually a really fascinating artist.
Yeah, I think he will work really well for those slice of life type of comics, where you
Yeah.
definitely need to emote and and draw people in normal settings, and I feel like he's perfect for it.
Yeah, it almost makes me think of like Terry Moore almost. The way that he gives
Mhm.
everybody
Right.
their kind of they have a distinct weight in the space. It's not just comic characters kind of laid out on a panel. And I feel like Terry Moore in the modern day is somebody who's really talented at that, making everybody feel like they like exist in a world.
Mhm.
Well, look, this is our first slice of classic X-Men. We could maybe read all of X-Men as long as we can keep Fariha's interest engaged in
Yeah.
it. And so we would love to hear your thoughts on that. And we would love to hear your thoughts on if there's things other than just X-Men that you want to hear the three of us talk about. That would be interesting too. But I want to turn it over to Fariha and Tyler to close us out with some final thoughts on these two stories that kind of set the tone for all of modern X-Men. So Fariha, here you are at the beginning. Does this help you contextualize some things that are happening in some of the relationships in Dawn of X?
I hope it does, because or else it wouldn't make much sense. But the thing is, like, I'm just kind of looking at it like, look, if my beau, like Jonathan Hickman, can read this novel, like these books, and then write his own version, why shouldn't I read them as well? That's why I'm just looking at it. But no, I mean, I'm excited. At least reading this too, it just made me think that, hey, there's a lot more to learn, and I think I can get there. And so I'm excited to continue on.
Excellent. What about you, Tyler, coming back to these issues? What are your final thoughts?
For me, I think recontextualizing hotspots aside, this really brings me back to the time when I first read it, where I'm a little bit more carefree and where the world is slightly different from the current world right now, and where I'm living in a completely different country and climate at that point in time. So there's definitely a lot of nostalgia going on, and but I'm glad that I have a reason to to continue to read this. If we get enough people yelling, say, or if we don't get a lot of people saying no, please don't read this anymore.
It's interesting that you bring up nostalgia, because I have a lot of nostalgia for these issues and going back to when I originally read them, but also, my daughter, I've been reading her Uncanny X-Men since we've been here in New Zealand. It's just one of the things that we started doing together to have a thing to do together, one more thing. And so to me, I have my original nostalgic love for them, which comes from my meeting them kind of in the early 90s. But then I have this whole new set of nostalgia where when I read these issues, and we've read every sequential issue of Uncanny into the 200s now, and she has the Epic Collection in her room and probably is reading it right next door to her right now. I have a whole new set of memories about these, and I have her questions and what she thinks is cool about them layered on top of mine. And so it's really, I always love reading them with new readers. That's to me now become my favorite part of it. Like my impression, especially of the core Claremont stuff and stuff like Giant Size, my own impression of it matters less than kind of like all of the conversations that I get to have about it and everybody else's impressions and opinions. So that's what makes me excited about doing this, is getting to talk to the two of you. I mean, I could just reread it. I mean, it's all here in my house. I could reread it anytime, but it's just not as exciting to me to reread it by myself. It's exciting to me to reread it with you.
It's like we've been always saying, reading X-Men should always be done together.
I think so.
Yep.
We'll leave you on that heartwarming note. So look, stay tuned to the channel, to the podcast. There's a lot more X-Men content happening right now because we're right in the middle of X of Swords, and that stuff is full spoilers. But we also might have some more thoughts on some classic comments for you too. So Tyler, Fariha, thank you so much for making time with my crazy difference in time zones to be with me and to do some X-Men together with friends here. It's always a pleasure. And this was really fun to get to dig into with the two of you.
Thank you so much. And
thanks for having us.
Yeah, and tune in for more from Crushing Comics.